Welcome back to Wearing History. Today we're going to talk about 1910s underwear because that's one of the things I get asked the most is what do you wear for underwear in the 1910s period? Now this is not an exhaustive study by any means. This is an ongoing study for me that I've been doing for well over 10 years and I seem to learn new information all the time. So I will give you some basics that will help guide you with what to choose for your underwear for the 1910s. The first question I want to ask is what part of the 1910s are you looking at doing? Are you looking at like 1911, which would be longer lines like this? This is like what we think of for the Titanic time period. Is this what you want to do? Or is it something more like World War I era, which would be something more like this? Because they are two very, very different silhouettes, and they would use different types of underwear. The most simple way to think of 1910s underwear is in terms of what would you use to keep your clothing the nicest and to keep your body the most comfortable. In this time period, bras did come around. They started in the early 1900s. They weren't always worn though, so they were a sort of you can choose it or not type of thing. They didn't really come into general use until the 1920s. So you would need something next to your skin that would protect you from your corset, and it would also protect your clothing. You would need a corset, which helped with your waist, and then you would need possibly some sort of bust support. Not always, though. Not every woman used bust support. In addition to this, you need something for your skirt and something for your legs. Okay, so something next to the skin, a corset, possible bust support, something for your legs, and a petticoat. Those are the 5 essential things for the 1910s. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Fashion was moving really fast in the 1910s, much faster than it did in previous decades. So, the look for the Titanic era, which is very up and down, compared to the look for World War I, which had sort of an A-line and then got slimmer again, is very different. Because fashion moved fast, things changed along with fashion. Now, the things that people ask me about a lot are combinations. What is a combination? How was it worn? Was it under the corset? Was it over the corset? We'll get into that. First, let's talk about what goes underneath the corset. Underneath the corset, you would have either a chemise, which is like a shapeless garment that's pretty much like spaghetti straps or sleeveless. And you would have that next to your skin. Or you could have something that was called a knit vest, which would be like a modern tank top. That goes underneath the corset as well. I have a blog post on this that I'll try to link below so you can check out that because some people have never heard of knit vests before. This is the first time you've ever heard of it. Yes, they did have very comfortable knit garments that went under their corsets and they were very popular, which is why you don't see a lot of them. So let me show you something for a treat. Here is a knit combination suit from the 1910s. It has a crotchless sort of construction. So this would be so you could go to the bathroom. You would wear this under your corset. It's super comfy. They wore these all the way to the 1930s. I'm not sure whether this one is 1930s or 1910s, but they didn't really change. So this would be one option to wear under your corset. Of course, you would have to replicate this. There are no patterns available that I know of. The other easy option is a chemise. I don't have an original period chemise. It would, like I say, just be a shapeless garment that would go underneath the corset. The great debate. Do you wear your drawers underneath your corset or do you wear your drawers over the top of your corset? And the answer is it doesn't matter. Do whatever works for you. Women did both in the time period. What are drawers? If you don't know, drawers are like what you think of as pantaloons. They sort of are for your legs. It's some sort of bifurcated garment. And usually they were crotchless. And it was not for like risque reasons. It was simply because they needed to go to the bathroom. And when you're wearing a corset, you don't want to undo all the layers to sit down and go to the bathroom. Next thing you're going to use is a corset. And this is where a lot of women are very unhappy because they've heard that 1910s corsets do not cover the bust. And that is generally true. Generally, they were under bust. However, there were some corsets which would come up higher on the bust. Generally, they were aimed towards older women or stout women, they called them. Women in larger sizes that needed more bust support. So They did exist. They are in the minority. Most women wore underbust corsets. I happen to have a 1910s corset. This I got from my lovely friend Lauren, Virtuous Courtesan. And this shows you they're very, very straight compared to prior time periods. It was focused on narrowing your hips rather than making your waist smaller. So sometimes your waist would get smaller, but depending on what period of the 1910s, it didn't necessarily make your waist much smaller at all. In fact, in some period publications I've seen, they talk about this, how did they say it? It was like this wider waist period and how ugly it was for women because they didn't like that it was not cinch your waist in as much. Of course, keep in mind that these women were corseting since a very early age. Even children wore corsets. So their bust-waist-hip ratio was completely different than our modern bodies, which are used to modern unrestricted clothing. So like, I don't know, I haven't worn high-waist jeans for years in my teens, and I can tell that my bust, waist, hip are very small. There's just a very small difference between them. Of course, it depends on body type, but in general, what you see in period patterns is there's a larger bust, a smaller waist, a wider hip. The hip was wider even in the narrow period. That could be because there was not much bust support, your bust point would be lower, and that could be why the bust is not as pronounced as in some earlier time periods. Now, let's see, we've got the chemise, we've got the corset, and on top of that, you need a corset cover. Now, I do have a pattern for a corset cover. You can find it in my shop, wearinghistory.clothing or Wearing History on Etsy. I have a 1910s one that's super cute. Your corset cover basically covers your corset on the upper part of your body and goes to your waist. One of the reasons you can tell that garments were meant to go over the corset instead of under the corset were because there are buttons that would go up the front, or there would be a definition for the waist. So that will give you a hint as to whether it's for under the corset or over the corset. Corset covers could be with little sleeves that would help protect from the underarms from sweat. They also could be sleeveless, and for evening, they could be straight across with little ribbon straps, which is quite cute. For your drawers, like I said, bifurcated garments. The earlier part of the 1910s were still somewhat semicircular. And as you get to 1919, they get very, very narrow. And they get more to like what you think of as flapper bloomers, right? Sometimes they even would have the elastic at the knee, like we see in the romanticized version of Victorian time period from silent movies or the like. Now, what is a combination? A combination was a combination of either a corset cover and drawers for your legs, or a corset cover and a petticoat. People now think of them in terms of a corset cover and drawers. That's not what they only had in the period. In the period, you could have the corset cover and drawers, corset cover and petticoat, or corset cover, petticoat, and drawers. It was very complicated. So all of that would usually go over the top of your corset. Like I said, another hint is, are there buttons that go up the front, and is there a waist seam? If there are buttons up the front and if there's a waist seam, generally it would go over the corset. The reason being that the buttons would rub against the corset when underneath it, and it would dig into your skin. I know this from experience. And after my research kept going, I realized my mistake. When you get to see in the later 1910s the envelope chemise, which is something that I do have in my store, I have a 1916 envelope chemise. It's basically a chemise with a little flap that would go from the back of the garment into the front and button in place. It's all cut in one. It's sort of like a tent shape generally, or it can be like a tube. No waist at all, no waist restriction. That can go underneath your corset, and it's actually quite comfortable. If you see combinations of a corset cover and drawers that have no waist seam and it's very much like loose garment, that can go underneath your corset as well. Now people say, what about these French postcards? They are French postcards. They are meant to be risque. Which looks prettier? The drawers underneath the corset and seeing the beautiful waistline, or the drawers on top of the corset and not showing the pretty corset at all. I think that the one showing the corset would be more in favor for the gentleman of the time period that was a little bit more risque. That's my personal take on it. Now, I don't know. My research is still continuing, so I may come back on this later. Okay, so what about the petticoats? The petticoats, they were very slim in the 1910s until about 1914. Very slim with a flounce at the lower part. Truly Victorian has a great pattern for this. And then as you get into 1915, 1916, they get more A-line. So you would have a distinct shape. And oftentimes they had very romanticized ruffles, very, very pretty, floaty, lacy concoctions, and they're just lovely. My very favorite petticoat that I have that's a period original is next to me, and it's from around 1915 or 1916. So I will show you. She is very, very pretty and very simple at the top. Just gauze. You get down to the waist and you have this lovely drawstring. This is called beading, very wide. There would be a ribbon that would run through that. And then the flounce at the bottom are these beautiful rosettes of lace. And you can see it makes a scallop, which is quite pretty. This is so typical of this time period. The fashions of the 1910s were very fun in that the boys are off at war. Here we are taking care of everything that has to be done on the home front. And you get very, very, very practical clothing, but you also get very, very overly romanticized clothing. And some of the petticoats of this time period are the iconic example of that. All of the lace, all of the ruffles. It's like you can have this beautifully tailored suit that looks very masculine according to period terms, and then underneath have these beautiful flouncy, lacy petticoats. They did also have taffeta petticoats, and that could help hold out the figure. So I think that's about it for that show and tell. Let's see if we can find something fun to show you in a catalog. Catalogs are useful because it is a great way to get a look at what the average woman in America, or whatever country has the catalog, is wearing at the time. These are from 1911, and they are definitely the lovely taffeta, which would make a great swish when you walked. And you can see at the top it has the fitted to the body, and then there's the lower flounce. Let's see. Here are some corsets from 1911. Shows you the very linear figure. Here are some knit combination suits and knit vests. Those were all options to wear underneath your corset. The ribbing that you might notice on some where it has a different type of ribbing at the waist. It's very interesting, but it would not make it so that it would be uncomfortable. It would just make it so it looked prettier. It served a different purpose, because if you knit at all, you know that the differences in the ribbing can make a big effect on how the garment fits to your body. Here are some lovely combination suits with eyelet. And regular petticoats with lace, cotton petticoats, which are quite pretty. And some corset covers. So you have all sorts of options, and this is just, oh, I forgot the princess slip. How could I? The princess slip was meant to go over the top of your corset, and it is the exception to the rule where I said that if there's nothing at the waist, it goes underneath. This is not meant to go underneath at all. Princess slips had a specific purpose. The purpose of the princess slip was to go underneath the princess dress. The princess dress is like we have today. I know it's not terminology that's used as often. It's a dress without a waistline. The princess line would be cut down the body and down the biggest part of the bust. to the waist and the hip, and all of the shaping is done in those seams. They started being very popular around 1908, and it was the beginning of this very linear fashion. They thought of it as directoire, like empire style somehow, but definitely the princess slip came in at this period. So around 1908, possibly a little earlier, the princess slip makes its appearance, and they are meant to go under dresses with no waistline. That is the specific purpose. So if you had a beautiful lingerie dress, which are the see-through white dresses of the time period, sometimes we see them called tea dresses, which is not a correct period term, they would wear the princess slip underneath, and it would cover all of the corset, all the underlayers. You wouldn't see any of that, but you could see the princess slip material through the outer garment, which was often eyelet or other type of lace that was see-through in parts. So that is 1911. Let's look at, this is 1916, and I think this is a sale catalog, so there might not be a whole bunch in this. I probably should have pulled a different one. Other things here are some corsets, and we don't have a high bust corset. Actually, this one right here is probably pretty high bust for that period. And as long as it cups below the apex, you usually would have enough bust support. They wouldn't go all the way over like we think of with some corsets today. Elastic was coming into popularity this time as well, so you would start seeing corsets with some elastic to help with control. And here are some petticoats. And you can see the difference in the petticoats that I showed last time. These ones are much more A-line in shape. You can't really tell, but you saw my example. They're quite a lot fuller than they would have been in the 1911 time period. And this is only a difference of 4 years. That's a very fast change for fashion. Here are some princess slips and drawers. And then I want you to notice the envelope chemises down here. This would have been a pretty new fashion in the time period, and this is the type that would go underneath your corset. And then we have some corset covers and braziers. The braziers are generally the ones that have the seams. These seams would be flat-felled seams, and they would provide more bust support, and that hook would hook onto your corset. Okay, I think that looks about it, but you see how pretty these are. Just beautiful. Beautiful of the time period. Okay, so I think that is my wrap-up for my somewhat quick talk on 1910s underwear. To recap, something next to your skin, the corset, possible bust support, corset cover, something for your legs, and a petticoat.